I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. This week, Bill and I talked with an old friend, Steve Lamar, who is also the president of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, to talk about tariffs and the effect on clothing and footwear. We'll have a great conversation, and we hope you enjoy it. All this on The Trade Guys.
Well, welcome, everybody. This is Trade Guy Bill with Trade Guy Scott, and a special guest who is a veteran of the Trade Guys, has been on before, and it is Steve Lamar, who is the president and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. And we particularly wanted Steve to come on at this point because if there's any industry that's going to be affected by tariffs, that has always been affected by tariffs, it's the apparel and footwear sector, which is a notoriously high tariff sector under normal circumstances anyway, and now is getting hit again, or may get hit again, depending upon how all this plays out, with even higher tariffs than the ones that have been applied for 40 years. So we particularly wanted to talk to Steve to get his sense of what's going on in his sector and how all of this is playing out. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott to lead the discussion. Go for it, Scott.
Well, thanks, Bill. And Steve, thanks so much for coming on to the program again. It's always good to talk to you. And your industry is so global. I mean, things in the apparel and footwear sector come literally from everywhere, including the United States. So there's a complexity and a richness to what we have as consumers. What we're really interested to start hearing from you is how has the initial set of announcements and the high tariffs against China as an example, and all the announcements that revise the previous day's announcements, what's that done to the industry? What are you hearing from your members, and how are they responding to keep in business?
Well, thanks, guys, for having me on. And I would just say there's been a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion, and a lot of consternation about the new tariff policies, the new tariff announcements, the tariffs that have actually taken effect. Bill, to your point, we've been hit by tariffs a lot for the last 95 years or so, dating back to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which actually celebrate their 95th birthday this coming June. And we're layering on top of that a whole bunch of new tariffs, which are already applying. So it's not a question of announcements that haven't happened or, this pause that, we're not going to do tariffs while we negotiate. We do have tariffs that have taken effect. And I think it's important if you sort of take a step back to look at why this is so tough, so hard for our industry. We get imports from all over the world. About 97% of all the things that we have in our wardrobe, clothes, shoes, or accessories is imported. We make some stuff in the United States. Some great manufacturing does still occur here. But the vast majority of what we dress ourselves with is produced offshore. Now, about 75% of the value of that is attributed to U.S. value, design, compliance, logistics, retail. But the actual final manufacture, the creation of a product, about 97% of that occurs offshore. Another number, 96%, that's the percentage of the population of the planet that we live on that wear clothes and shoes that live outside of the United States. So if you take those two numbers, 96 and 97%, that tells you if you want to be competitive in our industry, you need to have access to global consumers. You need to have access to global suppliers. And when you start putting tariffs in, you create obstacles for that access, both obstacles on the export side, obstacles on the import side. And as that number gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it transitions from being a extra cost that gets injected into the supply chain that becomes an inflationary cost to actually an import ban in effect. And that's sort of what we're looking at right now. You've got some of these tariffs, we're looking at an extra 10%, which is tough for anyone to do, tough for our industry as well. But that's a number that you can sort of figure out how you can work with and manage. Ultimately, it's going to end up with the consumer, often in the form of higher prices. But at least that's a number you're sort of thinking about. So that kind of takes you in the inflationary stage. When you're looking at a number like 145%, which is the extra tariff that's been put on China or U.S. imports from China. But in our industry, that's 145% on top of the Section 301 tariffs, which are anywhere from 7.5% to 25%, on top of the MFN tariffs, which are anywhere from 5% to 65%. Now you're talking about numbers that are above 200%. That operates as an import ban, where you just simply can't make a product at a particular price point. And companies don't ship, they don't import, they don't make, they don't buy. And then you start to see production grind to a halt, and that includes production in the United States. So we're facing some pretty strong problems and issues here, either inflationary or existential, depending upon your product mix, where you are in the supply chain.
Well, we talk a lot about supply chains in pretty clinical terms, but these are real people who have real business relationships that have developed over the years. You don't instantly, sever ties with a freight forwarder and then recreate it the next day when the policy changes. These are making your members' lives quite difficult. And in some cases, feel like fast fashion looks like it became instantly obsolete. So what's the range of sort of concerns from members? What are they asking you to do right at the moment?
Great questions. I mean, they're asking really for the pain to stop and for us to kind of inject more certainty, more predictability back into this. I mean, there's two large concerns. One is if you are adding costs to a supply chain, suddenly you add them, you take them away, you add them again, you pause them, maybe you're going to add them in the future. There's all these questions that keep getting asked and they're not answerable. And then if you make those announcements take effect immediately, then it's really, really difficult to pivot supply chains. And I'm not even talking about moving supply chains. I'm talking about making sure your existing supply chain works. There's announcements that the administration put into these new tariffs to deal with goods on the water, which is an important gesture. But in some cases, those goods on the water provisions don't actually reflect what actually happens as the goods are being transited. And so I put my goods on a boat, I'm done. I feel like I've loaded the boat, but if the boat doesn't leave the port for 3 days, for some reason that's outside of all of our controls, even though I think I made the deadline to qualify for the goods on the water provisions, I didn't because the boat left too late. And therefore, I think I'm not going to pay 145% extra tariff, but I find out 3 weeks later that I am. And so you run into these really detailed questions, and the administration doesn't have answers to them because they put these things out very quickly and have been very, very slow to create the frequently asked questions. That's why you normally want to have, when you make an announcement about these things, to, some time where you can figure out, what are the likely questions that you're going to get. You go to some experts, people that really do this stuff on a daily basis, and figure out if it's going to work, if you've missed something. But all this was done almost overnight, and that's created a huge level of confusion, as I said, and uncertainty. And then there's a large basket of questions that kind of connects back up to what are we trying to do here? And you guys, ask these questions, and we've had these conversations in the past. What is the point of a tariff? What's the point of these particular tariffs? Are we trying to raise money? Are we trying to promote U.S. manufacturing? Are we trying to increase diversification away from China? What are we trying to do here? And depending upon how you look at any one of these tariffs on any particular date, you'll come away with a different answer. And that's really difficult. It's hard for me to tell my members that the administration wants more manufacturing to occur in the United States when my manufacturing members are among those screaming the loudest because of the tariffs that are occurring. And then also the retaliation that's beginning to occur that's happened in a couple of countries. It's hard for me to tell my members diversify from China when the countries where that diversification should go to are also being penalized. It's hard for me to tell my members build resilient supply chains in free trade agreements, which are these long-term predictable partnerships we have with, nearshoring countries when they're getting targeted as well. So, I think they're asking for answers. They're asking for certainty, and for an administration where chaos seems to be a feature, not a flaw, I'm not sure that anyone's going to really be able to give that to them, at least for the time being.
Yeah, I've made the point that this is a textbook example of arbitrary and capricious. You don't really know why it's happening or what's happening. And plus, the further problem is that you don't even know once a decision made if it's going to stick. The tariffs have been on, off, up, down, postponed, reimposed, no exceptions, then maybe exceptions. Today, we're recording this on Thursday, April 24th. The story is maybe there are going to be some exceptions for auto parts, not your thing. But then that was one rumor. And then Trump says, no, we're not doing that. Somebody else says, well, yes, we are. We're going through this right now with China, where Trump says we're meeting with the Chinese and the Chinese say, no, you're not. Truth is something that's sort of vanished from the landscape. I have no idea what's going on. But let me ask you, maybe go into a little more detail, if you can, about supply chains. Scott alluded to fast fashion. I mean, that's stuff that comes here finished, and it just arrives and you put it on. The supply chains, tell me a little bit about what kind of supply chains your members have. What's coming here and what's being finished here, and how does the supply chain work?
Well, it's a great question. And I would say that in our industry, we have a concept called one size doesn't fit all. And I think that applies to supply chains as well. And not only supply chains between different companies, but supply chains within individual companies. I mean, obviously there's things they do to try to be efficient across their own internal company supply chains. But, they look to build product cycles using partners where they're the most efficient, the most effective at being able to get the particular, supply chain componentry done, the task done. Very often, there's a very common one that we talk about, and I've worked with you guys on, for example, the Central America Free Trade Agreement. That's a supply chain where you often see U.S. cotton becomes U.S. yarn, becomes U.S. fabric. It gets sent down to, say, El Salvador or the Dominican Republic. The fabric gets cut, it gets sewn. Now you're combining it with a bunch of other components, buttons, zippers, sewing thread, pocketing, other kinds of items. Then it gets finished into a finished product, gets assembled, packaged up, all the tags and everything gets put on, and then it gets brought back up to the United States where it's distributed. That is, one particular supply chain that involves a great deal of U.S. content, not just the intellectual property and logistics content, but also the physical content, U.S. yarns and U.S. fabrics. You've got those same kinds of activities that will occur, but they may start where you're in, say, India, and you're using cotton that comes from another country, either India, you might be in Egypt using Egyptian cotton, and you can look to these supply chains and realize there's like different elements that will take place. When you look at footwear, that's even much more complicated because you've got a lot more activity that is involved in the actual production of the shoe, more so than you might have in the production of a particular article of apparel. Same thing with accessories. If you're making a backpack or a handbag, there might be a lot of complication that you're putting into that. And so it really depends on what's happening with a particular product. What you will find is that over time, supply chain expertise on a particular product will build up. So tailored clothing, you get some expertise in particular countries. There may be a material that's available in certain countries, making sweaters. China's really good at making sweaters, and so on and so forth. And you can kind of go down the list and find that there are countries where there's sort of a comparative advantage or a specialization where they tend to make more of those. And so if those countries are hit with higher tariffs, sometimes it's very difficult to move that supply chain. It takes years to qualify a new factory. It takes years to find new expertise, new partnerships that can do all of the things that you want them to do, not just the production, but the compliance activities, making sure that the production is ethical and responsible, making sure that their own suppliers are ethical and responsible. Those things don't happen overnight. They take years to build up those partnerships. So then to turn around and say, we want you to move things overnight is a task that's not able to be accomplished.
For the tariffs that have been announced, the potential new ones, do they take into account the amount of American content that goes into the import? So if the shirt is coming from Honduras, is the tariff assessed on the full value or only on the non-American value?
That's a complicated question. There are some provisions that do allow some diminution of the tariffs if you have a certain percentage of value in the product. It's kind of interesting because it seems like it kind of comes out of nowhere. It is actually connected to a concept that we have in trade policy. We refer to it as 9802, where you export a component and then you assemble it abroad and you bring it back and you only pay tariff on the foreign value added. This is a little bit different, where as long as you can get above 20%, then the value of the U.S. content isn't taxed that extra 10%. This is these so-called reciprocal tariffs that have been announced. However, these extra 10% tariffs do apply to products that are qualifying under the U.S. free trade agreements that we've negotiated. And in our industry, the free trade agreements have very, very high rules of origin, which require you to use a lot of U.S. content. So on one hand, these extra tariffs apply to products that contain a lot of U.S. content. And then there's another provision that sort of backs part of that out. With the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and the extra 25% tariffs that were put on, after a couple of days, they actually relaxed the imposition of the 25% tariffs on those qualifying goods. So here you've got, Mexico and Central America and literally the same kinds of operations that go on where we take U.S. yarn, U.S. fabric, we ship it to our partner country, turn it into a completed garment, and we bring it back to the United States. And they have almost identical rules of origin, and yet we're treating them very differently based on whether they were part of the February 1st, 2nd tariffs that were announced or the April 2nd, April 9th tariffs that were announced.
One thing we seldom hear about is anything from the Congress. And that has always surprised me. You and I worked together, and I became an instant expert on pockets and liners because the Georgia delegation was en fuego over pockets and liners in Central American trade. It was the craziest thing ever. And I remember USTR Rob Portman was like, he didn't know what hit him. But they seem awfully quiet. Are they not hearing from constituents? What's going on?
They're hearing from a lot of constituents. I think there is, it's disappointing that we're not seeing Congress be more active. Article 1, Section 8 is the provision in our Constitution that gives Congress, sole authority over tariff policy. And so all of these decisions really should be emerging from Congress, or they should be emerging from a conversation between the administration and Congress. And that's not happening right now. I would argue that in order for us to really have a durable trade policy, we need Congress's involvement because Congress is really the best way to get sort of widespread constituent involvement. So to make sure that something can truly incorporate the perspectives of diverse communities all across the country. I mean, that's, I think, literally what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they gave Congress the authority for taxation and for tariff policy. And I think there's a lot of questions about, did Congress, in fact, delegate tariff policy through the creation of the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act statute or not? I think there's an open legal question about that maybe that'll be answered in time. But right now, you certainly have an opportunity, I think, for Congress to weigh in. A lot of constituents are communicating with them. We've been on the Hill a number of times. Mm-hmm. Our members have been availing themselves of their First Amendment rights to seek redress of the grievance, both with Congress and the administration. And we know that many members of Congress are communicating with the administration, and there are a number of places where Congress is taking action. Will that actually, to use an industry term, move the needle? It remains to be seen. But we definitely, do believe that Congress has a very clear role here, and we would hope they would step up more on that.
I just finished moderating a panel on the IEPA question with a bunch of lawyers and customs brokers. So I'm filled up with IEPA arguments. I would just note there are now 6 lawsuits pending. There was another one filed yesterday by a bunch of state attorneys general, in addition to one filed by the state of California, and several others filed in one case by individuals, in one case by members of an Indian tribe, and in 2 other cases of either one company or several companies. This is going to be litigated, and I think, Scott, a future episode, we should spend a little time on what the arguments are, because there are many. Steve, you alluded to the big one, which is who has the authority here? Is it congressional authority or is it executive authority? And can the Congress delegate its constitutional authority without any instructions or constraints, or can they even do it at all? And this will all end up, I'm sure, with the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing I noticed today was that this is actually moving along faster than I thought. The government is trying to get all the cases consolidated in the Court of International Trade. 3 of them were filed in various district courts in Florida, Montana, and California. The government's trying to get them consolidated, and the Court of International Trade has already assigned a 3-judge panel, and they have already issued a decision on the request for a temporary restraining order from one of the cases to prevent the tariffs from going into effect. They denied it, by the way, but that's without prejudice, I guess, to a further request for injunctive relief. So we'll see how that develops, but this is going to end up being a big deal. And as one of the panelists said, that this is one of these cases where 25 years from now, there's going to be another day-long law seminar in which this case is going to be discussed. Just like we spent a good part of the panel today discussing the Yoshida case, which was in 1972, following President Nixon's invocation of 10% tariffs back in the day. But anyway, digression. Let me ask you this, Steve. You alluded to this in the beginning, and it's been a question that has come up a lot, which is, what's the goal here? What is the president's goal? What is he trying to accomplish? And you're exactly right. He said different things at different times, including revenge, rebalancing, get even, negotiating tool to get other countries' tariffs down, a revenue-raising device, which of course conflicts with the other goal, because if you want the revenue, you don't want the tariffs to go down. You don't want to negotiate them down. And the fourth one, which I want to ask you about, is let's bring manufacturing back to the United States. And the tariffs are Trump, in contrast to Biden, who was a carrot guy. Trump is more of a stick guy. And let's use the tariffs to bully you into bringing your manufacturing back home. And there, of course, you want to keep the tariffs because that's the incentive to do that. Let me ask you, in your sector, footwear and apparel, how likely is it that manufacturing is going to come back to the United States?
Well, that's a great question. We continue to hear a lot of conversation about that. And I would say that certainly the threats of tariffs, very high tariffs, has really kind of ignited a lot more conversation about, can we bring manufacturing back? Can this occur? And the answer hasn't really changed since it was asked a couple of weeks before that and a couple of months before that. I mean, people are constantly trying to figure out what they can do in the United States or what they can do in nearshoring countries. And we still run into the same issues about, either the lack of skills, lack of capability, lack of materials, a wide variety of obstacles that really prevent the production of apparel, the production of footwear at scale in the United States. We do have apparel and footwear domestic manufacturers. I've been to a number of wonderful facilities all throughout this country, and they make great product. But we as a country have not created the system in place to grow that more. We've held on to what we still have. As I said, it's about 3%. We use a variety of policy tools. Some of them are tariff related, but mostly there are other things. The biggest way we have domestic manufacturing is something called the Berry Amendment, which requires the military to be dressed in clothing that's made in the United States from U.S. materials. And if we were really serious about doing more apparel production and more footwear production at scale in the U.S., we'd be looking at strengthening the amount of product that we buy under the Berry Amendment. There's a number of loopholes in the Berry Amendment. We'd also eliminate the largest competitor under the Berry Amendment, which is federal prison industries. A lot of people don't realize this, but the largest supplier of uniforms to the military is the U.S. federal prison factory system. So at a time when our country is rightfully making sure that we're not importing product made in a forced prison labor situation, that same government has a huge addiction to domestically made forced labor prison production. So if we really wanted to make more apparel in the U.S. or make more footwear in the U.S., we wouldn't have federal prison industries be at the top of the preference scheme. We wouldn't allow them to compete for contracts as a small business or as a woman-owned business, which our country does right now. And so I think there's better policy tools than tariffs to bring about more production. Even if we were to sort of unleash all of those policy tools, it would still take some time before we would quite literally be moving the needle that we're talking about. We're going to see more production sort of on the margin for sure. There's been a growth for about 10 years now where you've seen a little bit more production occurring here and there. Factories that are up and running are starting to, they're opening up another line. That's a very, very slow process, and it's not something that's sort of replicatable at scale.
Steve, is it still true that U.S. producers are mainly in the yarn and fabric business, that those elements are still, in terms of our relationship with nearshoring partners, those are still U.S.-made elements, right?
Well, yes and no. And again, just to kind of sort of replay the question back so people understand what we're talking about. People talk about textiles and they don't realize that they're really talking about textiles and apparel. And sometimes they put footwear in there too. Textiles is yarns and fabric. So, if you have a shirt, the shirt is made from fabric, right? Fabric that's cut up and then sewn together. Rolls of fabric are made from yarn that is, knit or woven into the fabric. And the yarn itself is made by either spinning or extruding it from the base materials, the fibers from which it comes. And so there's a lot of fiber, yarn, and fabric production in the U.S., not nearly as much as we used to have, but still a sizable amount. It doesn't give us the variety and the quality and the quantity that we see in other parts of the world. So that's one of the other obstacles to a reshored or a new shored industry, is that they're not going to be near the raw material that they need. interestingly, one of the things that we're probably going to see here, I think over the next 10 to 15 years, is the development of a robust circular recycling industry. And if you kind of think about producing, you guys are manufacturers. If you think about making stuff, you want to you make stuff from your raw material, your feedstock. What is the feedstock for recycled fabric? Well, it's used clothing. We produce an awful lot of used clothing in the United States, probably the most anywhere. So there are companies, there's a number of them that are setting up production to do a better job of collecting. There's some new policies on the books in various states to create more efficient collection of textiles. Those textiles will then be fed into these systems, either resold or upcycled or recycled. But what you need now is the facilities that can take those, that used clothing, those used shoes, and convert them into brand new material, which can then be made into either locally into more apparel and footwear or other, fabric, other textile items, or exported and made offshore. So 15, 20 years from now, we may be looking back at a revitalization of the U.S. textile industry, not sort of the traditional yarn and fabric plants that we have now, but a brand new industry that's made up of these recycled facilities that have come online. And by the way, tariffs is not going to make that happen. Other things will make that happen. It won't be tariffs.
That's for certain. Steve, you've been very generous with your time. Bill, do you have a final question?
No, I was just going to reflect that, when I started working for Senator Hines, the largest manufacturing employer in Pennsylvania was the apparel industry. Everybody would think it's steel. It wasn't. It was apparel. We had a lot of knitting going on in the eastern part of the state, and it's all gone. But that was 50 years ago. But huge change in our economy. And I think you've done a really excellent job of spelling out the problem that companies face in trying to bring manufacturing back here. It's a lot more complicated, I think, than the administration believes it is. And the scale question is a big one. So, we'll see what happens. I think what we're hearing from a lot of companies is also something that Steve alluded to, which is the time question. Even if this happens, the tariffs are now, in your case, if companies are going to come back here and build a plant here, that's years down the road. And so in the interim, things are going to be more expensive.
Well, and Bill, to that point, I would also say that in addition to tariffs not being the catalyst to bring production back at scale, tariffs will be the catalyst to hurt the production we already have. We are actively seeing that right now. And again, actually, the factory that's in Pennsylvania that I've been working very closely with. So one of the things we're doing with the administration, you asked what we're doing, is really trying to make sure they understand that, there's a lot of, I think, support for kind of the end goal of some of the end goals the president has articulated. He's talked about reducing foreign trade barriers. He's talked about creating better jobs. He's talked about making sure that inflation doesn't come back, about creating opportunities for Main Street Americans. And I think there's a lot of ways that trade policy can be done to advance all of those causes. There's also a way that trade policy can undermine all of those causes. And I think the path we're on right now is, and I give the president credit that it's not what he's trying to do, but he's creating some real problems where it's making some inadvertent problems for those very same individuals that he's trying to help, like U.S. manufacturers.
Fair enough. Steve, thanks again for coming on the program. We'll look forward to checking back with you at some point and seeing if there's light at the end of the tunnel or if that's simply an oncoming locomotive.
And my question is, if I get invited back for the third time, does that make me now a trade guy?
Oh, definitely.
Of course.
You've always been one.
You're already a trade guy, Steve.
Excellent.
You don't have to come back. And our one item of Trade Guys merch is an apparel item. We have Trade Guys onesies.
Yes.
And both Scott and I have grandchildren that have benefited from that.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks a lot.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.